Hey everyone, I'm Ben Norton, and this is the Empire and Deep State series that I'm co hosting with the American Exception podcast. And I'm joined by my co hosts, Aaron Good and Seamus McGuinness. This series is based on the book American Exception, Empire and the Deep State by historian and political scientist Aaron Good. And today we're going to be talking about John F. Kennedy. We're going through a chronological history of the US empire and deep state. And this is part 3 of our discussion of the JFK administration. And in the previous parts, we talked about JFK's early life and political career. We talked about the Bay of Pigs and Cuba. We discussed Vietnam and Laos or Lao. And today we're going to be discussing JFK's administration, foreign policy, and its relations with the global south or the third world. And specifically, we're going to focus on Indonesia and Africa. So there's a lot to get at here. I mean, the JFK administration, is very complicated. His political trajectory changed even when he was president, of course. We've discussed how when he first came in, he had a more kind of conventional foreign policy, but he started butting heads with parts of the military establishment, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the intelligence agencies. And what we're talking about now in this third part is JFK's transition toward becoming much more critical of U.S. wars and intervention and much more supportive of nationalist, anti-colonial leaders in the global south. And this is clearly a huge factor in his assassination. And let's just, Aaron, let's set the stage here. How did JFK's thinking evolve? How did his foreign policy evolve from when he entered as president? And especially, how did his policy toward the global south change?
As a senator, Kennedy had been more out there on foreign policy and criticizing the colonialism of the French, especially in Algeria and in Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and so on. But he was also an establishment guy who generally believed in the establishment that his father had kind of joined by virtue of making a whole lot of money and then allowing his sons to have good political careers. Now, towards the third world, JFK favored a policy of engagement, more or less, which is a little different from the Eisenhower Dulles situation or their general policy. Eisenhower, Dulles, Dean Acheson under Harry Truman, but especially it gets worse under Eisenhower and Dulles. Dulles says essentially that neutrality is a sin, and that if you're not on the side of the U.S., then you may as well be on the side of the Soviet Union and communism. JFK had a more nuanced approach about this. And there's the good book on this is by a history professor, Robert Rakove. It's called Kennedy, Johnson, and the Non-Aligned World. And he details how Kennedy sought a practice of engagement with the formerly colonized countries, meaning that you could work with them and allow them to develop on the basis of models that they themselves wanted to put in place. So you could tolerate different policies that were nationalist and even socialist, if it helps these countries to try to develop. It was a little bit more tolerant in theory than the Dulles Acheson consensus and the sort of colonialism of the earlier eras. And it could be described as cooperative nationalism. Okay, that Kennedy accepted that the U.S. was going to. He's the president of the United States. He's going to pursue interests in the interests of the United States, but he didn't think that he thought that it was in the U.S. interest to help other countries pursue their national interests. So to support third world nationalism, to allow leaders to develop their own countries in basically along the lines that they wanted. But he was not a communist. He was anti-communist. So he wanted decolonization to play out in a way that was actually real and would allow for these countries to pursue their own interests, which is a departure from what Dulles and Acheson really wanted, especially Dulles. Dulles was supposedly against colonialism, but really was totally for neocolonialism.
Well, yeah, and as we've talked about a lot now, I think the underlying story here of the series, we took a lot of time talking about theory for a reason, because a big part of this story is, what liberalism says versus what it does. And Schlesinger and Kennedy are sort of the liberals of a new age that kind of have different commitments to breaking down empire, and not just in the sort of post New Deal sense, but specifically, and I think Schlesinger is a good sort of intellectual idol of the new frontier people in the Kennedy administration, is that they have this idea of the problems that arise out of liberalism, the crises and the contradictions, are answered by more liberalism, more aggressive forms of the same. And that limits, even though we see that Kennedy is sort of pushing those limitations, there are these limits to the structural change. And you have these commitments, like we're talking about, to anti-communism on the global stage, that are inherently contradictory within their own approach of the Alliance for Progress and everything, because there are these limitations on, we want to see these conditions improve, but with the limitation that it has to be within merit and the market and all of those things being tied together, and that if we just are more vigorous in our liberalism, that will be the answer. And so I just kind of wanted to preface with that, because we're looking at some of the things that are well intentioned, and some of the freedoms and I guess the well-meaning liberalism of the Kennedy era or the New Deal, has a certain undercurrent that limits how much it's actually able to accomplish. And I think we've laid that out pretty explicitly over the past episodes. But for JFK specifically, he has to play this balance between the sort of rabid anti-communism of his local, of the domestic political world, specifically his military, and then have this sort of, pure, not pure intentioned, but well-intentioned liberal interest in seeing the conditions of life improve in the third world. So, in your view, how does he strike that balance?
Well, one way to try to make sense of what Kennedy, the way that Kennedy was trying to perform the Balance Act, is to look at the guy, Walt Rossdale. Okay, he was an academic. He's also a super establishment guy. I mean, Walt Whitman Rossdale was his name, his full name. And his brother, Eugene Rossdale, was also a big establishment character. He comes into this story later on, but I don't want to spoil that now. This will be in a future episode. But Walt Rossdale was an establishment guy. He was with the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, on top of other things. And he was an academic who came up with modernization theory. And he even wrote this book called he called it a non-communist manifesto. Okay, that was like the title or the subtitle. And it was about it put forward his theory of modernization. And it was a way to, it all seems kind of a little nutty now, because we're so used to neoliberalism that we've kind of forgotten what made American liberalism even attractive. I mean, the liberals, that when we say liberal today, we're not talking about the liberals that were American liberalism. I mean, there's a reason why they say Nixon was the last liberal president, but it's because the policies really changed, and you end up with this sort of dystopian neoliberalism, to where you wonder why anybody would ever want to be associated with liberalism in the first place. But in the US at this time, you did have a society where people enjoyed, political freedoms, and also a lot of prosperity, that you'd had widespread prosperity in the United States. Yes, you still had groups that were cut out of this, and it was built on enormous amounts of exploitation, and it was tremendously unequal, but it was still plausible to make a case for liberalism and capitalism at this point without being a complete liar. And so this is important to keep in mind. It's kind of hard to wrap our minds around today. Now, Rossdale, in the third world, you had Marxism, historical materialism, Marxism. They kind of that posited a teleology, really, of the way that economies and civilization were going to develop. Okay, that you had all these exploitative systems and class conflicts over time, and really the march of history is a bunch of class conflicts, and eventually you have capitalism, which sweeps away feudalism, but capitalism creates these two classes of exploiters and the exploited, and eventually, because the capitalists create this class that's exploited, they're going to eventually create the forces of their own demise, that they're creating their own gravediggers, as Marx said, right? And that eventually you would have this move towards communism. Well, Rossdale wanted a different teleology, and so he comes up with modernization theory, and this is like a liberal teleology. Okay, so it's funny to think about how Fukuyama kind of puts forward his own neoliberal teleology, and it's even more ridiculous than Rossdale's. But Rossdale's was that what the difference between America, and the third, what we call the third world, I'll say third world a lot because it makes sense in this context. The first world is the industrialized West, and then the second world is the communist bloc, and then the third world is formerly colonized countries. Okay, so the rest besides the first.
I want to add a
world.
quick note on that, because the way third world is sometimes used in the global north today, it is used in a kind of racist way. You'll hear people say, oh, well, it's like we're from a third world country, or the US is becoming a third world country. And that's obviously racist. But in the original conception of first, second, and third world, it was actually Mao who, if he didn't create it, he helped popularize the concept. It was not in any way a racist concept.
Sukarno especially was the third world guy.
Yeah, and Mao frequently in his writings, you look that he constantly wrote about first, second, and third world, that the first world was the imperial core. Of course, world systems theory comes later, and Wallerstein and all of that. Today, what you could call the imperial core, and the third world would be the periphery. And in world systems theory, the second world would be the semi-periphery. Or in the first Cold War, it would be, the Soviet bloc countries, the socialist bloc countries allied with the Soviet Union. But I mean, it's not saying third world is not in any way racist. And in fact, there was a very strong third world nationalist movement of people who proudly use the term third world.
Yeah.
And,
right.
and
to me, that the system is worse than the nomenclature. Like, some people really do want to get hung up on that, but like we know it's just a way to refer to what I want to refer to. So most people probably are going to be okay with that. But if you're not, sorry.
Honestly, third world is a better term, because technically, I mean, I use Global South because it's more accepted. But if you look at a map of the third world countries, not all of them are in the Southern Hemisphere. Yeah. A lot of them are, it's true, but not all of them. And then Australia is like, Australia is technically part of the West, but it's also not in the West, and it's also in the South, even though it's part of the global North and the West. So these terms are not just geographical either.
Yeah. And Ben, you were referring to when it gets thrown around. One of the most insane times, of course, that comes to mind is after January 6th. All the pundits going, it's like we're a third world country. And the fact that it's used as an insult, when originally, and I don't know that this really was like the core meaning, but the idea was they tried to make, the first world was created, and then they gave it another shot, and we're going to, you're talking about teleology, that we're going to rebuild a third world, and it's going to, actually have the interests of the people in mind, of 4 or 5 billion people, the majority of the people in the world, rather than just those in the global Atlantic North. And the fact that it's been co-opted into being used as sort of I'd hate to say a slur, but an insult for some kind of like chaotic lack of governance, when pretty much every single third world coup was, of course, backed by the US. Like, it goes beyond irony and goes to a very, it's very representative of the way that those dreams were dashed again and again by a very specific group of people, exercising their power over it.
Yeah, when you get into, when you get into these areas, it's also ironic. There's deep irony and kind of really cynical business as well. When you have Kennedy assassinated, one of the things that John McCloy says is like, we need to show the world we're not like a banana republic, which is ironic because people like him were like the people that were on the board of United Fruit Company, which was, and the CIA backed them, and the same sort of forces got rid of Kennedy. So like, he was wrong. We're ruled by the same people that rule the banana republic, which is corporate interests.
What they're saying really is, and this is the same with like January 6th and stuff, that rhetoric is the coups and the assassinations and the terror and the crimes against humanity and crimes against democracy that we carry out around the world should be carried out in those countries, not in our countries.
Yeah.
In the periphery, not in the core.
Right.
We should have the sense that we have some, participation in democracy, because that keeps people, like we keep talking about, invested, that their well-being is invested in the maintenance of American empire.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what this whole business is. This modernization theory is a way to package American progress as something that would be attainable for people in the third world. So it's a teleology that says, okay, you start out with this traditional society with an agricultural based economy and lots of everything is very labor intensive, not capital intensive, very little trade, outside of the borders, and a population that kind of has a primitive worldview. They don't believe in science and technology so much. And then you have these preconditions that arise to allow for a takeoff. You have a little bit more manufacturing, rudimentary manufacturing, a little bit more of a national, international dichotomy. Like they start to look at more than just their own territories. And then you eventually have a takeoff, an economic takeoff, a short period of intense growth where you have industrialization and workers and institutions become concentrated around new industry. Then the drive to maturity, which takes place over a longer period of time with rising living standards and more technology. The national economy grows and becomes more diverse. Finally, you have the American, self-actualized state of an age of high mass consumption. So Western countries were part of this last quote stage that was like they were developed officially, and the country's economy is like flourishing in this capitalist system characterized by consumerism and mass production. So this was a way to put forward an idea to the third world that they could pursue these policies. They don't have to be communist. You can actually have development without communism. And it's in terms of the particulars of it, it's well to the left of what is advocated nowadays. So this is a difference. And it was a way for Kennedy to be like, okay, anti-communism is a total reality in the United States. You cannot, these things are anathema to what American foreign policy would want to be, and so on. Or what you could pull off at it with American foreign policy and American domestic policy. But we have a way to say, hey, we can actually improve living conditions here as well, which would not always be the case in the US. This actually was a time period where some of these policies allowed for some growth in the developing world or in the third world. Developing world is another weird one. I don't even want to try to unpack that. But the point is, there were elements of this that were relatively progressive, but they were very anti-communist. And it was formulated as an anti-communist idea or a non-communist idea. And this guy, Walt Rossdale, who Kennedy brings in, is one of the main architects of the Vietnam War. And I think that's notable. Now, in practice, what this meant calling for in the third world was allowing, and the Bretton Woods institutions kind of allowed for some of this as well. Even the early IMF was kind of going to function this way, to allow countries to pursue nationalist policies of development. So you could have especially import substitute industrialization, okay, meaning that the things that you used to import, you would target certain things and then try to foster your own industries in this country. Like if you wanted to have a dairy farming industry because you don't want to import milk anymore, for example, or like textile industry. Maybe you want to start making your own clothing. You want to start making your own machinery. Find ways to do that, and you can put tariffs on certain goods to raise money and to engage in protectionism to protect your balance of payments position. Like these were all kind of reasonable, progressive policies that were not like free market right-wing dogma approaches. Okay. Now, and for the 50s, 60s, and the 70s, really before the oil shocks, and really even through the oil shocks, because they were given loans, the developing world experienced continual growth, and pretty consistent growth in these areas. Now, at the same time that this is happening, you had things like CIA covert operations that would overthrow governments that went after really the more important and valuable holdings of corporate America. So it still was a neo-colonial system. They weren't given the ability to like actually execute whatever policies in the national interest that they wanted to. And it wasn't just the communists that they wanted to crush. They also wanted to crush nationalists if they were in possession of valuable resources. I mean, places like Congo, Lumumba wasn't really a communist. Dulles even admitted that later, for example. Neither was Sukarno, but they had really, really valuable areas. So they would not be allowed to pursue these kind of policies. But other countries were. Later, the US policy becomes really best described by like Ha-Joon Chang as kicking away the ladder. Like Rossdale, at least development theory kind of offered a ladder of development, and it's a ladder that was similar to what the US used to develop its own economy. The US developed its economy in the 1800s, especially following the ideas of Alexander Hamilton and this American system where you had tariffs. Tariffs were the main source of income. Tariff and the sale of Western land for the early United States of the federal government. They didn't have an income tax, and the tariffs would go. The money raised from tariffs would make American products more competitive because the other ones are more expensive. But also, it raised money to build canals, especially, and other early infrastructure projects, especially canals. And this really allowed for an American takeoff. They also engaged in industrial theft. Really, they stole trade secrets from the Brits, right? But then when the US becomes more powerful, they want to crack down on these practices later. So eventually you end up with modernization and kind of liberal theories replaced by neoliberalism and free trade dogma. And that's what Ha-Joon Chang calls kicking away the ladder, meaning the US developed with nationalistic trade policies and protectionism and import substitute industrialization. And when they get to a position of really hegemony over the global economy, then they start kicking away the ladder, not allowing other countries to develop this way. And it's a good way to try to understand what the US does. And this era of the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s, where the US did try to allow for some kinds of development, as long as you don't run too far afoul of corporate America and you weren't communist, then you could pursue these policies. This changes with the end of Bretton Woods. But this is what Kennedy was doing. And Kennedy was doing it with an establishment guy. This is important. These guys are establishment dudes, but they're coming up with some sort of liberal thing that you can say will actually improve lives. We do care about improving lives. We do want to show that democracy and capitalism can work and make the world a better place, and still have the rich guys, but they don't emphasize that. But so it was a way to have progress, but still be an establishment friendly guy. But we come to see that those things are in conflict.
And a real quick side note on that idea of 18th and 19th century development. A big part of that is these productive forms, the corporate productive form, and the legal constructions around that, and the lack of a central bank that sort of plays this limiting role. You have a lot of more dynamic liquidity in the financial system because it's so spread out. But of course, it's a lot more unstable and messes with your ability to control international trade, hence the creation of the Fed and so on. But a big part of that, and to your point about import substitution, if you take an economics class, you hear that as sort of the gospel of development still. It still is kind of taken as that's the answer. And that kind of comes from the old Ricardo comparative advantage thing that, again, if you've been in an economics class, you know that the assumptions are a little unrealistic. It tends to be you have two goods and the capital is freely interchangeable between the industries, as if you could switch from making butter to computers and have it be freely interchangeable instead of going across borders, say, like we see in reality. But Harvard, of course, is no fan of general non-specialized economies, let's say. But a bunch of data scientists at Harvard went and they put together this atlas of economic complexity. And Steve Keen has done really good writing about this, that what they found was actually the exact opposite of import substitution is true. And so technological advancement and economic growth is always correlated with overall diversity in your economy, rather than specializing in, say, a monocrop economy, which limits your ability to have interplay of different sectors, different technologies, new forms of production. Because if you look at Japanese car production in the 80s, like you're still getting innovation of productive forms that does create advantages that you don't get in a monocrop economy that's enforced from above by an imperial hegemon. And so across the board, if you take all of these international trade flows and these data scientists put them together, it is very conclusive evidence that specialization is not the answer. And I think that's a good thing to stay focused on is that you will inevitably see more progress when you're allowed to develop your own internal economy, not autarky, but just a certain amount of self-sufficiency rather than being reliant on one industry, because then you also are a slave to the general global market and global labor arbitrage and the ability that capital can just up and leave if your labor costs get too high or you get too many unions going. So that's just an important note on what exactly is successful about these third world nationalist movements. Even if they're not explicitly communist, it's more of their ability to create economic self-sufficiency in the domestic economy rather than just building a specialized economy that in the moment to, you Chicago economists looks great, but in the long term leaves you a lot more susceptible to crises and to be abandoned by whatever market that you're bought into.
Well, and the point is to keep those countries dependent on the imperial core and exporting raw materials. So if you don't develop your local industry, you have to be dependent on the import of the advanced technological goods and other products from the core. I mean, that's the whole point. And, this is very relevant today where we see there is this energy crisis that's going around the world, largely because of the proxy war in Ukraine and the Western sanctions on Russia. And countries that do have energy sovereignty have been able to maintain much more stability, whereas countries that are forced to import energy, of course, are in much more difficult circumstances. And we see global inflation. But if you have a self-sufficient economy, not only in terms of local industry, but in terms of resources and things like energy, the government can subsidize those products. They can keep them at very low prices. And Bolivia is a brilliant example of this. Even though Bolivia doesn't have energy, doesn't have local oil and gas, it does have other natural resources like lithium. But the government has been able to maintain through a state-led mixed economy, but led by a socialist economist, Luis Arce. They have actually one of the lowest inflation rates in the entire world. And when he spoke at the United Nations at the General Assembly in September, Luis Arce presented this very interesting 12-point program, a revolutionary program for transforming the world and supporting socialism against capitalism and all these things. And he has one of the points is about his economic program, and everything he says is it's basically import substitution industrialization. He talks about the key tenets and how he said the reason we're successful is because we do the exact opposite of what the IMF tells everyone else to do. So, yeah. I mean, that's a clear example today of a clear historical echo of these kinds of leaders. Luis Arce very much follows in the footsteps of the third world nationalists and the socialists who were carrying out these programs of developing local industries based on the model that the imperialist countries themselves had used to develop their countries, and not on the IMF model, the Washington Consensus model. But anyway, getting back to JFK, I mean, this is, of course, all related to the JFK administration and the debates and conflicts that were going on within his own administration. How did these ideas of modernism, modernization theory, development economics, how did this pan out in terms of the JFK administration's foreign policy toward Africa in particular? Because this is, of course, the peak moment of decolonization struggles across Africa.
Right. Everything was up for grabs in Africa. I mean, it was in terms of how this decolonization was going to play out. There were people who wanted Africa to be for Africans, and then there were people who wanted it to be the same as it was before. And so how was this going to play out? There's a good book on this, on Kennedy's policies in Africa, by a guy named Philip Muhlenbeck. It's called Betting on the Africans. I got a picture of the cover here. And the subtitle is John F. Kennedy's Courting of African Nationalist Leaders. And this it gives much more details than I'm going to go over here, because I'm just going to mention a couple things here. But Kennedy's policies in Africa were, Kennedy was very popular in Africa, especially because of his speeches about Algeria, where he spoke about colonialism. And this was not the way African leaders were used to hearing Westerners speak about their country. It had been a really brutal stretch for Africa for decades and decades, really, more than a century. Really, Africa was the first place that the explorers kind of started to take advantage of the Portuguese as they sailed all around Africa, right? So this goes way back to like the 1400s and it'd been a tough number of centuries. Kennedy was a Western leader speaking about the evils of colonialism, and he was the head of the most powerful country in the world later. I mean, he was a senator at the time, but then, when he was the president, they were very excited in Africa to have somebody like them. But him there before, as he takes office, though, he has this issue with Congo, and we'll come back to this. But Kennedy supported leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, the first anti-colonial leader, the first successful decolonial state was Ghana, and Kwame Nkrumah was a person that the Eisenhower administration was not that friendly with, but kind of tolerated because they wanted to be seen on the right side of as being on the right side of decolonization. But Kennedy was more friendly to him and tried to work with him more. The CIA under LBJ would apparently effect a coup here and get rid of Kwame Nkrumah after Kennedy left office. But Kennedy supported him and tried to help him in different ventures, and tried to woo him away from the Soviet being a neutral or even Soviet friendly. Kennedy wanted to work with him. He also worked with, tried to resolve the crisis in the Congo created by the Lumumba assassination. So a great book on Kennedy's Africa policies is JFK Ordeal in Africa by Richard Mahoney. The cover image is, of course, Kennedy's reaction to the Lumumba assassination, which Eisenhower approved. Eisenhower authorized Lumumba's assassination. So you see that Kennedy, already in an image, you see a difference here between Kennedy and the Dulles policy. These things get reversed. So Kennedy's was a reversal of the Dulles policy, and then later, when Kennedy's gone, these policies revert to the Atchison-Dulles line, and they have a puppet in running the Congo for 30 years, really. And it's a reversal of Kennedy's policies. So he favored policies that would help Africa develop much more than what came before and after him. The most pro-Africa politician or president the U.S. has ever had.
So we've talked about Indonesia previously, but to pivot back to it, where we left off is that JFK comes in. There's an ongoing conflict between the Dutch and Sukarno over the Netherlands, New Guinea. JFK has no clue about the gold mine issue that Dulles and the Rockefellers are pretty monomaniacal about. That's really the long game here over decades of time. And of course, this is Alan Dulles's intelligence masterpiece. So, of course, JFK is going head to head with the same set of characters. But this is where some of the highest stakes political maneuvering happens. So how does JFK deal with another similarly resource-rich region of the world in Indonesia?
Well, as you say, he inherited a really messy situation, and it was Dulles's stage setting for him in Indonesia. And Dulles had a long plan that he'd already been working on for a couple decades by the time Kennedy takes office. Very resource-rich island nation, and these are the current borders of Indonesia. But on the east, you have this very valuable area here, West Papua. Okay, now under Eisenhower, they had become more reliant in some ways on the U.S., but they'd also become close to the Soviet Union in various ways. We'll see. Dulles was aware of the gold that was located there and also aware of massive oil deposits, and Kennedy was not. So Kennedy takes office, but really you have continuity in the CIA with the personage of Alan Dulles. And so this was going to be one of Kennedy's key challenges, and it was more important than Kennedy was even aware, because crucial facts were kept from him at this time.
So in the decade leading up to this, or let's say 15 years leading up to this, the UN has been in large part a handmaiden of U.S. imperialism, of course, enabling things like the police action, quote unquote, in Korea, and so it's very much been used for the same purposes that everything else in the national security state is by Truman and Eisenhower, but Kennedy seems to have the idea, and of course, with the entrance of Dag Hammarskjöld, maybe this is possible, that the UN can be repurposed for the interest of the world and for third world nationalism and for more of a neutral process than something that would alienate the Chinese and the Russians so much that they are, boycotting it for 10 years. So how does JFK then try to use the UN as he's going into third world policies?
Well, besides JFK and Alan Dulles, who are going to clash over what happens in Indonesia, and of course the Indonesian head of state is a big player there as well, Sukarno. You have the UN and Dag Hammarskjöld. Dag Hammarskjöld is the head of the UN, and he's Scandinavian, Swedish, I believe, right? And he was one of the great statesmen of this era, and he was someone who was in favor of managing decolonialism. He was in favor of self-determination for the developing world. So a lot of the information that we have here comes from the Hammerschold angle comes from Greg Polgrain's book JFK versus Alan Dulles. And some of this information we've covered in past episodes, but the video for that got destroyed. And so I'm going to review this here, and happily we're going to be able to salvage these slides, which I repurposed for this. So I hope that people can handle the repetition if you've been following the previous Indonesia series very closely. And to my mind, it's worth hearing more than once because it's actually kind of dense material and very important. But this was how they were going to Kennedy was going to try to use Hammerschold in Indonesia. That's an important part of it. But also, Hammerschold was instrumental in helping Kennedy deal with the Congo as well. So maybe that's the best place to start. You have once Kennedy takes office and realizes that Lumumba has been assassinated, he gets the word from Adlai Stevenson. Other people didn't bother to tell him. You have this Congo crisis. And it starts in July 1960. You had Patrice Lumumba was the first elected prime minister of the Congo. And he was wanting to use resources of Congo to help the Congolese. And this would have been this would have made U.S. and British and Congolese interests very unhappy because there are valuable resources there. You end up with the Congo crisis in July of 1960. So the Belgian side revolts. They take advantage of the chaos of decolonization and independence. One of the Belgian generals, a guy named General Janssens, writes on a blackboard, "Before independence equals after independence." And this kind of summarizes what the policy was. Now, Lumumba wants to work with Dag Hammarskjöld and be able to have the UN help to safeguard his country and keep them independent. Congo crisis, you have the country trying to break apart, or elements in the country. This breakaway province of Katanga, led by this Belgian / Western stooge named Tshombe, declares Katanga, a very resource-rich province, to be independent. You eventually get the United Nations operation in the Congo, UN operation in the Congo, and they weren't authorized to really quell unrest or get involved in fighting. But the UN was the only way that the U.S. would be allowed to help under Eisenhower. Eisenhower wasn't going to commit dedicated U.S. forces to this. So it was going to be through the UN, and Lumumba had been working with them. There's an image of Lumumba meeting with Dag Hammarskjöld in New York City. They met over July 24th and 26th, I believe. And then very shortly afterwards, the next month, Alan Dulles and Eisenhower, they order Lumumba's assassination, declaring it an urgent and prime objective. You have the coup on September 14th. Joseph Mobutu, a CIA asset, declares himself to be the new, head of Congo, and Lumumba gets captured. Infamously, images of his capture. We have a newsreel too that we'll show. And on January 17th, he's finally assassinated. Now, 1975, and Kennedy gets the word of his assassination and is obviously devastated about it, as captured in this image. So in 1975, the Church Committee report mentioned this poison plot and another shooting plot to try to kill Lumumba. But their position was that those failed, and so therefore the U.S. wasn't responsible for the assassination. The minute taker interviewed by the Church Committee actually recorded that he recalls Ike ordering the hit. Okay, this was not known until much later, I believe around year 2000. It was published in The Guardian. And it was revealed that the records behind this were only revealed because of the JFK Records Act. So somehow it also served to declassify more of the Church Committee reports. There's still some things that are missing, by the way, that haven't been declassified yet, as I understand it. I think Richard Helms' testimony might be among those, but I'd have to go back and look that up. But this is another area where the JFK Records Act reveals important parts of our own history, like Eisenhower actually ordering that assassination. To my knowledge, that's the only documentation of a U.S. Head of state authorizing the assassination of another head of state. We don't have that for the Castro plots. The Inspector General report said that the CIA was acting without Kennedy's authorization. And that was released, many years later. It was conducted in the 60s, but then only came out later. But who knows? It could be standing policy of the CIA not to admit that that's the case, that it was ever given authorization for these things, just as a way of maintaining its power with the president and the sort of veneer of like the president as being in charge of things. That the CIA might even at times say, oh, we didn't have authorization for something we did have authorization for. We'll never know. You can't prove a negative like that. But at any rate, we do know that Eisenhower authorized the assassination of Lumumba, and that he was killed after the fact. And it was very, obviously serendipitous for the U.S. I have a newsreel here that I'll show you, that I'll play to that shows the way that it was depicted in the United States, I think is really astounding. It was contemporary news footage. So this would have been from 1961, before he was killed, or at least before his death was known. So here we go.
A new chapter begins in the dark and tragic history of the Congo with the return to Leopoldville of deposed Premier Lumumba, following his capture by crack commandos of strongman Colonel Mobutu. Taken to Mobutu's headquarters past a jeering, threatening crowd, Lumumba was impassive at this lowest ebb of his stormy career. Mobutu watched as his troops manhandled Lumumba, but promised the pro-red Lumumba a fair trial on charges of inciting the army to rebellion. Lumumba was removed to an army prison outside the capital as his supporters in Stanleyville seized control of Oriental province and threatened the return of disorder. Before that, Lumumba suffered more indignities, including being forced to eat a speech, which he restated his claim to be the Congo's rightful premier. Even in bonds, Lumumba remains a dangerous prisoner, storm center of savage loyalties and equally savage opposition. Arriving in Los Angeles to begin a 4-day honeymoon after a midnight wedding in Elizabeth, New Jersey, are actress Sandra and singer Bobby Darin.
I just wanted to let that last part play with Sandra Dee and Bobby Darin for the contrast there. So that footage to me is really amazing. And if you don't have a pretty strong hatred of Western imperialism, maybe that clip would give you a little bit more fuel for that. I mean, they say the music is like sort of dark and scary, the way and it depicts Africa, in that way. They say the dark and tragic history of Congo, which is like, yeah, why is that? What's made it so dark and tragic? And then they call Lumumba pro-red when really he wasn't. They make no mention of the fact that he was democratically elected. Mobutu is a CIA asset. Of course, that would not be mentioned. I mean, they wouldn't know that, but it's pretty obvious now. They say that Lumumba, rather than being the democratically elected prime minister of Congo, they say that he was inciting the army to rebel, and that he'll be given a fair trial. Well, he was elected, so he can't. That's not really incitement. He's supposed to be the head of state in Congo, and he wasn't given a fair trial. He was executed. He was beaten and then executed by firing squad, and then they dissolved his body in sulfuric acid to make sure that there'd be no remains or any spot that would serve as a sort of rallying point and make more of a martyr out of Lumumba. So that was the reality. And then, of course, in this news clip, you see they talk about Bobby Darin and the starlet who's the starlet. The name escapes me now. Sandra Dee, I think they say Sandra Dee and Bobby Darin, right? Which is like essentially like, imagine if you saw like a clip talking about how great it was that Gaddafi got killed and Hillary Clinton laughing about it, and then the next thing that comes on the screen is like something about Kim Kardashian. I mean, this is just history kind of repeats. It's really something. But this was an example where you have the UN trying to get involved. People like Hammerschold would have tried to work with Lumumba. Kennedy wanted to work with Lumumba. The United Nations wanted to work with Lumumba. A lot of Congolese people wanted Lumumba to be successful, but these Western powers weren't going to let it happen. They assassinate him, and they're able to subvert the policy of the incoming president of the United States and the United Nations. Those things don't matter. Instead, you get the policy of Allen Dulles and the imperialist West, and that is a policy of assassination and neocolonialism.
All right, so turning back to Indonesia then, why was Indonesia such a difficult foreign policy issue for the Kennedy administration?
Well, you had with Indonesia a real balancing act between the U.S., Soviet Union, Indonesia, and the Dutch, and the UN is an actor in this as well. The West Papuans are important, even though they're very powerless. You had the people of West Papua who also were a separate force potentially. In the U.S., the Dutch, that was their most valuable colony, was Indonesia, and really the most valuable possession was West Papua, although its resource wealth was known to the Dutch, but not to other actors, and it really hadn't been developed. So it was a very strange situation where they knew there was this windfall for whoever would end up with West Papua, but this was unknown to other actors. And it complicates things because the Dutch don't really have a legitimate claim to West Papua any more than they have to any other rest of Indonesia. It's colonialism. It's halfway across the world. It's obviously illegitimate, and that's becoming recognized, and colonialism's on the way out. The U.S. is worried about the Indonesia in the Soviet camp or the communist camp because they have the biggest communist party in the world outside of China and the Soviet Union. So they are potentially, but their communists were not doctrinaire Soviet-style communists. They were actually religious. They were mostly non-doctrinaire. They were largely not even that ideological. They were really largely just rice farmers and peasants who wanted land to be able to grow rice and survive and have a subsistence existence. For the U.S., it was perceived as a big Cold War prize one way or the other. So they didn't, and the U.S. also wanted to keep the Dutch friendly to the U.S. and keep a NATO ally happy and so on. So they had to negotiate this kind of carefully. Because the U.S. is a little standoffish towards Sukarno and it wants to be friendly towards the Dutch, and they don't want Sukarno to be able to supplant the Dutch, or at least maybe, they sort of do, but they don't. They're careful in how they manage the Dutch situation or the Indonesian situation. Like they actually want, and Allen Dulles actually wants the Indonesians to be able to kick the Dutch out of Western New Guinea. They needed to make that part of Indonesia, but he didn't want Indonesia to be too prosperous and successful. And Congress also wasn't going to give them a ton of aid necessarily either for domestic political reasons. The end result is that Indonesia has to go to the Soviet Union for an aid package, and they work out a big arms purchase. General Nasushin, who is pictured here in this image talking to Nikita Khrushchev, goes to Moscow, works out an arms purchase for fighter planes, subs, and warships, and the plan is to use them for the Dutch-Indonesian dispute over Netherlands, New Guinea. So probably another reason that the U.S. felt like they couldn't do this so easily, actually be the one to supply them with the weapons, was that the Dutch wouldn't be happy about it. So because Eisenhower had rebuffed all these requests for aid. Now, so the result is that you get this deal with Indonesia, and then the question is Indonesia more friendly to the communists now because of this? Ed Lansdale, who is notorious Allen Dulles acolyte and covert operations man, he writes a national intelligence estimate on the package, the arms package. It's about $600 million for arms and about $500 million for economic assistance. At Rand, you have Guy Pauker, who Peter Dell Scott knew, is a Berkeley professor also. He was he wrote reports on this also, and he questioned General Nasushin, one of the top guys for Sukarno over there, about this. And he actually tries to argue in 3 Rand reports in a journal article that Nasushin was unduly influenced by Moscow and was communist friendly of some kind. Nasushin is not happy about this, so he contacts Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and Howard Jones, who's the ambassador, and he wants to affirm that he is anti-communist. He wants to say, listen, I'm not a communist. Stop saying this, okay? But for different Cold War reasons, there's an incentive to characterize people as communists for different reasons. But Nasution himself was not a communist and really was pro-U.S. He would have preferred to do business with the U.S. and to work with the U.S. It's just the U.S. wasn't going to happen, wasn't going to let that happen. When during this time period, as Kennedy is being briefed on all of this, he's got the National Intelligence Estimate, and they're making plans about how to handle Indonesia. And he's also being informed of just what the U.S. policies were back in the 50s. And Kennedy is kind of shocked at this. And he says this at the time. He says, no wonder Sukarno doesn't like us very much. He has to sit down with people who tried to overthrow him. Okay. But Alan Dulles, meanwhile, is not explaining. He might explain what the policies were and some of the covert action stuff to Kennedy that they had been using against Sukarno. I'm sure he doesn't tell him all of it, but he never tells him about the prize in Indonesia. Alan Dulles knows about this, but Kennedy doesn't. And so, his response is probably just more to fantasize and think about the gold and the oil that's available in Indonesia and in West Papua that Kennedy doesn't even know about and that Sukarno doesn't even know about. The oil well, which became the most productive oil well in Southeast Asia later when it goes online in the 70s, it was discovered in 1941, and basically kept hidden, kept secret. The gold was discovered in the 30s in the Grasberg, this huge mountain gold deposit in West Papua, remote, but it was also kept secret except to the Dutch. And Alan Dulles was the person who created the company that funded the expedition that discovered this. So when he was working for Sullivan and Cromwell. So Alan Dulles is like this intelligence guy, but he's also connected to the pinnacle of Wall Street power. He was like their lawyer, essentially their intelligence man, as a oil intelligence person and lawyer going back to the 30s at least. So it's an amazing situation here with this, and the key players, and Kennedy and Sukarno are unaware of this. That is just staggering, I think.
And this is part of your point about them having to turn to the Soviets for aid. This is part of the problem with the sort of alliance for progress approach, which is that we have some kind of duty to, give foreign aid to the world, and obviously that's very familiar today. But even in Guatemala, part of how they make Guatemala appear that it's being taken over by communists is that they withhold any help, they withhold materiel, and then they have to get these arms shipments from somewhere, and they turn to the second world, and they end up with a bunch of basically useless weapons. But along the way, it's enough to malign them as somehow allying with the Soviets just because they're trading with them. And we see that in the case of Sukarno. And on top of that, the fact that you make someone like, even a large country like Indonesia dependent on U.S. aid, and the prospect of U.S. aid is that, if you make any other move, you're going to be, again, maligned as a communist like Sukarno was, or you're sort of just left hanging in the instability of economic collapse, especially with like the energy crisis and essentially the attacks on the Indonesian economy at the time. Sukarno does come to Kennedy a couple years after this in the same situation. The political capital is again not there to give him any aid, and that causes the kind of instability that either causes things like turning to Suharto and the right-wing movement, but also to increase support for the communists. And that's always what's going to happen, is sort of the Polanyi theory of people turn either left or right in a moment of crisis. And so if you're going to push for a Kennedy-style global liberal empire, then you also need to maintain some stability. And if you can't muster up the political capital domestically to give any help, then you can't be surprised when you can't maintain that relationship with the Indonesians over time. And that, that's part of the dynamics at play when you then turn to LBJ later. But how does, on the specific issue of Netherlands, New Guinea, and the gold mine, or the prospect of the mountain of gold, how did JFK want to deal with that issue with Hammerschold and with the Dutch?
Well, this ends up being, among other things, a contest between the spy master and Dag Hammarskjöld. So you could think of this as Alan Dulles versus Dag Hammarskjöld, and who really is going to decide how the world is going to be run. You have Alan Dulles, director of the CIA and de facto CEO of the American deep state. I think that's a fair characterization. He's tied in there, Sullivan and Cromwell, Council on Foreign Relations, clandestine operations. That this is really what we're talking about. Versus Dag Hammarskjöld, who is the United Nations Secretary General. And he is there to represent something like a global democracy, really. I mean, that's the word. Even the words democracy now are sort of tainted in a way because of the fact that it's the U.S. that's putting it out there, but acting in an oligarchic imperialist fashion, right? But always saying, "Oh, democracy, democracy." But the UN was the ambitions of the world, the progressive ambitions of the world, to have a world that was more characterized by a democratic global governance rather than top-down despotism. And I mean governance with respect for national sovereignty and so on. So this was very competing visions of the world, and they clashed. That Hammarskjöld represented something diametrically opposed to what Dulles was doing, and he pursued it that way. He was someone who legitimately wanted to help the third world to be able to escape Western domination. So Hammarskjöld's plan was to use the UN to eventually grant sovereignty to West Papua, to Netherlands, New Guinea. This is a discovery from Greg Polgrain, and this is, I think, a really major discovery on his part. He was able to find out about this by talking to George Ivan Smith, who was the right-hand man of Dag Hammarskjöld, and he interviewed him in 1982 and spoke about these things. But Hammarskjöld had already announced to the Economic Club of New York in March of 1960, he announced his program through OPEX and a special new UN fund, UN staff would become officials of the governments to which they have been assigned with the full duties of loyal and confidential service to those governments. So what this meant was the UN could set up special organizations connect with states, the state authority of the state that they were in, right? They would work with them to create competent administration in countries that did not have, that because of colonialism, really hadn't developed their own strong administrative states. Okay, so you could have people in an African country that had been colonized. You could have people who are UN officials acting as customs agents, acting as people overseeing the development of energy and infrastructure, things like that. People coordinating national policy on complicated issues where they could take advantage of their expertise and the fact that they come from more developed countries with better educational systems. They could use that to help these countries. So this is a very idealistic thing, and it's a way to deal with some of the issues that afflict countries that don't have modern developed infrastructure because of colonialism or because of how remote they were. I mean, West Papua, for example, wasn't so much a victim of colonialism because there was hardly any colonialism there. They hadn't really bothered to even, I mean, it's not that they would have exploited them and dominated them if they had been able to, but it was so remote and that it was difficult to really gauge. So this was a situation where the Papuans had been kind of largely left alone, but they weren't going to be left alone forever. And so you could have the UN work to have them create a functional state. That was Dag's plan. Okay. Now, Kennedy himself was wanting to talk about this Indonesia problem. And in 1961, when one day he meets with General Douglas MacArthur, who has some expertise in East Asia. And it was actually he had a headquarters on West Papua for a time, and he would have been aware of the oil at the very least there. Who knows? Maybe he was aware of the gold. You don't really know. I kind of doubt that part. But he met with him, and so JFK wanted to talk to him about East Asia. You know, at one point, MacArthur says, "Don't ever get into a land war in Asia," and Kennedy would bring that up later to people who were trying to get him to bring troops into Vietnam and such, and would say, "Oh yeah, convince MacArthur, and then maybe I'll listen to you." Okay, but he later was, Kennedy was in World War II. He was there with people in the Marshall Islands. He was rescued by people on the Solomon Islands, actually, to be more precise. And these are ethnically very similar to the people in West Papua. So the people in West Papua are not even Indonesians. If you see them, they look similar to like Australian Aboriginal people. They're like darker skinned. They look a little bit more like Africans than Asians. If you've seen people who are, the people that were called the Aborigines in Australia, First Peoples. And so Kennedy had some kind of sympathy for these people, and he actually wanted to have West Papua be independent, and he could use Hammerschold this way. Okay, so Kennedy's plan was really to allow the UN and Dag Hammarskjöld to sort of be his stalking horse for the policy that he wanted, which was West Papuan sovereignty via OPEX, which was that UN organization. The plan was to announce this in September of 1961 at the UN General Assembly. And this undermined the arguments of people who would say West Papua wasn't ready for independence. Because if you have the UN ready to step in with some administrative skill and resources, then you can weaken that argument, the argument of people who would say, oh, they're not ready for independence. So this was his way of, this was Kennedy's plan, and it was Hammarskjöld's plan. Kennedy met with MacArthur and Hammarskjöld in the same day, and then later in September, they were going to announce that.
All right, so we've gone over JFK and Dag Hammarskjöld's plan, but how did the Dutch want to deal with the issue of Netherlands, New Guinea?
Well, you have in the Netherlands here, the foreign minister is this guy named Luns, and he went to meet with JFK. JFK had a choice to make about all of this. He needed to choose between supporting a staunch NATO ally, which is the Netherlands, or supporting a very important and key third world government, which was Sukarno's Indonesia. April 10th, 1961, Joseph Luns visits the United States, and they have this strange negotiation or conversation. And it's a cat and mouse game of sorts. JFK is really puzzled about this. He's really puzzled as to why the Dutch were so concerned about this faraway island, which was really a great burden for them. Right? It was a great burden for them to even run it or administrate it. Why were they so focused on this island? JFK couldn't figure it out. And he couldn't understand why they wanted to continue with their maintaining sovereignty or control over West Papua. It appeared that the question was one of engaging us in possible hostilities on the political and maybe even on the military level over a very costly primitive area of no strategic significance. So this is the way it was recorded in the foreign policy of the U.S. The foreign relations of the U.S. books that they put out. Right. This was how it was explained at the time. JFK didn't get it. Why are they so focused on this? Because even there, very costly area of no strategic significance. Well, it actually had great strategic significance, enormous resource wealth. Okay, like one of the most resource-rich places on the whole planet. So Luns, when he's talking to Kennedy, he never mentions the gold or the oil. So this doesn't come up in the conversation. This is why Kennedy is confused. Kennedy, on the other hand, does not mention the OPEX plan. So he doesn't mention that it's even a possibility for the UN to do it. He's trying to keep the cards close to his vest. Luns wanted to talk to Dag Hammarskjöld and do so before Papuan independence to hope to bring the UN on his side.
So we've been talking about the policy of the U.S. government and other Western officials, but what about the Indonesian side? At this moment, Sukarno is president of Indonesia. He is a left-wing nationalist, socialist-oriented, and he was one of the co-founders of the non-aligned movement. So he's very much involved in this third world liberation movement that we were talking about earlier. What was his take on what was happening?
Well, Sukarno comes to the United States in April of 1961, and he has some cool photo opportunities here. You'll see some of them with Marilyn Monroe. I think this one is a great one, but kind of a disturbing one too when you think about what happens under LBJ. JFK asks Sukarno, he says, why do you want West Irian? Okay, West Irian, West Papua, Netherlands, New Guinea, the big island there with all the gold. so they're a different race, for example, than the Indonesians. Different language, different languages, and it was costing the Dutch more to administer the island than the Dutch would be able to get out of it. And he didn't understand why Sukarno himself was so fixated on it. The Papuans, they had a caste system of sorts where you had the Dutch were obviously had the most power, but they sort of were sparsely populated on the island. There wasn't a huge Dutch presence there. The Ambiri were there in Indonesia, and throughout Indonesia and at different islands, not just West Papua, probably less there. There was like this caste system of like people throughout Indonesia. The Dutch, the Ambiri, and then the Papuans were sort of like way down there, right? And the Javanese, the Dutch, the Chinese, and the Javanese in Java were the main sort of the sort of hierarchy, ethnic hierarchy. So because there was a Chinese population throughout Indonesia that was also traditionally maybe a little bit analogous to the way like Jewish people are perceived or the Hakka people are perceived in China. Like they were kind of a minority, but a minority that was prosperous. And so there was like this hierarchy there. And the West, it was hard for JFK to understand why the Papuans even fit into this for Sukarno, how they fit into it. So Sukarno didn't like the idea of a plebiscite. That was one option, to let the West Papuans decide what they wanted to do, if they wanted to be independent or if they wanted to be part of Indonesia. And this was something like a fourth world solution. Okay, this is sort of what JFK and Dag Hammarskjöld wanted for West Papua. A fourth world meaning that, like, what do you do about these nations, these peoples within territories that are not going to be colonized anymore, but there's new nation states, but not all the people fit into them, like ethnically and historically. And so this is sort of a fourth world, like not even a third world. We're getting into something even further away. The Papuans lived in highlands mostly, and they wanted independence. A lot of them didn't even know that the island had been colonized in the first place ever, or had been part of the Dutch. They didn't know of the dispute between Dutch and Indonesia. I mean, it's really a remarkable place, kind of divorced from time during this era. But JFK also, he's talking to Sukarno, and he knows that doesn't have all this freedom of movement. He's the president, but he already knows, after the Bay of Pigs and Laos and all these other issues, that he's got really powerful forces against him in his own country. At one point, Greg Polgrain tells us an anecdote about this, that JFK and Sukarno and Jackie went into the bedroom in the White House, and JFK said to Sukarno, "Well, this is the only place that the CIA can't eavesdrop on me, so I wanted to talk to you back here." But this was the setting that they were in and what they were trying to negotiate. So there's a lot of deception and lies of omission and so on by all the parties involved here in this: Kennedy, Sukarno, Hammerschold, Alan Dulles, most of all. And this was the setting this was the scene for Kennedy here. At this point in time, he still has Hammerschold and his plan, his sort of trump card, which is to use the UN to help to resolve this dispute, but also to bring Sukarno over to the U.S. side, and still keep him on the U.S. side, even though you're using the UN to pry West Papua away from both the Dutch and the Indonesians. I mean, this is a case of the president and Dag Hammarskjöld really wanting to do something positive, and for apparently not cynical reasons, which for us today is hard for us to even wrap our minds around, but there it is.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, there is still a lot more to this story, and we're going to continue that in the next part, but we're going to take a pause here because we're already at over an hour. There's still this issue of Indonesia comes back up again and again, especially when the U.S. backs a brutal military coup and basically a genocide in Indonesia, in which between 1 and 3 million people were killed in 1965 and 1966. The CIA was deeply involved in that. So Indonesia is one of those issues, like Cuba, like Bay of Pigs, that constantly returns in U.S. politics. Unfortunately, I think there's a lot of dearth of good information about what JFK's foreign policy actually was. And there's this facile portrayal that, JFK was just another U.S. president who was the same as all the others, and the killing was this freak accident. But clearly, everything that we're talking about is leading up to the 1963 assassination. And that assassination was directly related to his refusal to go along with a lot of these Cold War imperialist policies, his attempt to try to pursue peace and diplomacy. And we're still at the beginning of that. It's going to, I think, even pick up some more steam soon. So this is the Empire and Deep State series. I'm Ben Norton, and I'm co-hosting this with Aaron Good and Seamus McGuinness of the American Exception podcast. If you want to get early access to all of the podcast episodes, and I guess now video as well, early access, you can go to patreon.com/American Exception. And then eventually later, the episodes will be published on the YouTube channel. So thanks to everyone who watches or listens to this program, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.